It's easy to think that if a politician in the United States has enough skill and charisma to stand high above his peers, it's only a matter of time before he becomes president. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt. But American history is littered with examples of brilliant, popular, groundbreaking, and sometimes just interestingly unique political leaders who never took the presidential office for one reason or another. Welcome to Alternate Presidents, where every episode we bring you a figure who sought to hold the presidential office and consider how their presidency could have radically changed history had they been elected. Today's alternate president is three-time presidential nominee, Secretary of State, Senator, Speaker of the House, and founder of the Whig Party, Henry Clay. Clay's political career began in Kentucky, where he served in the state's House of Representatives, carving out an identity as an early advocate for infrastructure development and an early form of protectionism. Clay was, however, pragmatic and sympathetic to the divergent needs of the various political factions of the day. He sought balance between federal and state power, balance between elite and common interests, balance between the increasingly hostile free and slave states, always seeking ways for both sides to reach a favorable outcome, and for this, most especially his later work on the Missouri Compromise and resolving the nullification crisis, would eventually become known as the Great Compromiser. From state representative, he'd move on to national politics, briefly serving as a senator, before opting to instead seek office in the National House of Representatives, where he would be immediately elected Speaker of the House for his bold rejection of the more senior senatorial office for a position in the House. During his first years in the House, he was one of the chief instigators for the War of 1812 against Britain, recognizing a need to take a stand against Britain's interference with sovereign American trade. At his core, Clay could not stand to see the country subjugated to foreign powers, both directly and indirectly, and such would reflect in his later policy. Of course, Clay also wasn't one to not finish what he started. He would later play a major part in peace negotiations, the president feeling that Clay's role as the chief war hawk in Congress would allow American needs to be firmly conveyed, while reassuring Britain that if Clay could be appeased, so would the majority of Americans. It would be thanks to Clay that a favorable conclusion to the conflict was extracted via the Treaty of Ghent, refusing to make concessions to Britain despite the eagerness of his peers to make a quick peace. Following this, he would continue his post as Speaker of the House and put his vision of national infrastructure development into action, along with the enacting of protectionist tariffs. The War of 1812 revealed multiple weaknesses of the then-dominant Democratic-Republican philosophy which guided the United States. Democratic-Republican founder Thomas Jefferson had laid out a template for the nation which stressed demilitarization, decentralization, and an emphasis on agrarianism. This had left the United States logistically disorganized, unable to effectively defend itself in the event of a large-scale war, and dependent upon foreign powers for access to markets and manufactured goods. Clay believed that the United States as a nation needed to be brought closer together to foster state interdependence and efficiency, that domestic industries should be protected from foreign competition so that they might grow stronger, and that a national bank should be established to stabilize currency and provide loans through the government instead of through private banks. Clay's plan would become the foundation of what would eventually become known as the American System, a plan intended to make the United States a self-sufficient powerhouse capable of keeping foreign influences out and asserting its dominion over the American sphere. Protectionism would allow American industry to take off and create a domestic alternative to the industrial powerhouse of Britain. Infrastructure would make transportation of goods faster and cheaper, while opening new domestic markets for the agricultural South and West to sell their crops too. Centralized banking would eliminate the risk associated with private banks, while placing control of national finances back in the hands of the government. The American system was a plan of synergy between industry, agriculture, and commerce, something which might be aptly described as a spiritual successor to the old Federalist and Washingtonian agendas of achieving stabilization, self-reliance, and steady growth. Under Clay's guidance in Congress, the Second National Bank was established, and tariffs were enacted to create support from all parts of the country but the South, where faith in the creation of new domestic markets for cotton was low, preferring to maintain unrestricted access to trade with Europe, which Clay felt made the United States subservient to the economies of foreign powers and prevented the country from being truly independent. Tariffs would be fought by the South and compromises would be made, but ultimately they continued to remain in effect. Infrastructure would be the only pillar of the American system which saw little success on account of constitutional concerns that such federally organized projects disregarded the authority of the states. As a consequence of infrastructure development not being carried out, the southern states missed out on their complementary pillar of the system while the North and West grew increasingly wealthy from these pro-American policies. Before we go any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Folks, it's a weird world out there. Food is more expensive for some reason. People don't cook at home anymore, and sometimes the stuff you buy ends up going to waste. HelloFresh is here to offer a sustainable, time-saving, money-saving, and delicious alternative. HelloFresh subscriptions are as simple as going online, picking out a week's worth of meals, and waiting for them to be delivered right to your door. Recipes, ingredients, everything you need. I've used HelloFresh well before this sponsorship and can confidently say their meals never disappoint. HelloFresh sources their products from nearby farms, ensuring that the ingredients you receive are always fresh, and only sends you what you need, cutting back on waste and needless spending. We're talking 23% less food waste and an average of 72% less expensive than dining out or shopping. HelloFresh recipes are so simple they make cooking a breeze and actually very enjoyable. I'm old-fashioned, so I usually put on some oldies on the record player and let that go in the background in the meantime. And you might be thinking, hey, wait, you've got a pork chop recipe right there, but I don't see any pork chops. Did HelloFresh mess up your order? Well, dear viewer, I'm contractually obligated to say no. Seriously though, there was no mix-up here. HelloFresh will let you substitute certain ingredients to meet vegetarian, pescatarian, and low-calorie needs. I happen to already get a pork dish, so I decided to swap the other one for trout just to have a little extra variety. I'm looking forward to putting these together, and I know you will too. Follow the link in the description or use this promo code on the screen for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 surprise gifts. We should have a live counter in the description, so I hope to see a good lot of you give this a try. Now, with that said, let's get back to the video. Clay would launch his first presidential run in 1824, an election which turned into a 4-way race between Democratic Republicans from the Northeast, the Northwest, the Coastal South, and the Inland South. Unfortunately for Clay, he received the second smallest share of the popular vote and the lowest overall share of the electoral vote, even fewer than the candidate who had suffered a stroke during the campaign. Clay simply couldn't compete with his more well-established and more senior peers from the Northeast and Coastal South, nor the charisma of the third candidate from the Frontier South. That being said, despite not winning the presidency, he did come away with an appointment to the office of Secretary of State by the winner of the election, John Quincy Adams. We won't be considering a victory for Clay in this election given the sheer odds against him when compared to his other runs, but also because the effects of this in the subsequent election would significantly shape Clay into the man history remembers. Not merely because it allowed him to serve within the executive office of another president, but also because it would be in this election that Clay's future rival would achieve greater prominence than ever before, and in the following election see this rival, General Andrew Jackson, win the presidency on a message which appealed to the common American and called out the deeply rooted Democratic-Republican establishment, as well as denounced the embracing by some Democratic Republicans, Clay included, of more Federalist ideals. Nearly from the beginning, Clay was skeptical of Jackson, believing him to be a danger to the Republic on account of his populist rhetoric, his hardline adherence to democracy, his military background, and his domineering character. Many feared that Jackson would coerce the masses into granting him extra constitutional powers at the expense of Congress, and ultimately use this mob rule to act as a tyrant under the guise of democracy. In reference to Jackson, Clay is quoted as saying, "Greece had her Alexander, Rome her Caesar, England her Cromwell, and France her Bonaparte. We must avoid their errors." Jackson's ultimate victory in the 1828 election inspired Clay to take a firm stance against him and carve out from the remnants of the Democratic-Republican Party an anti-Jackson party known as the National Republican Party, later transforming it into the Whig Party, named so after Britain's anti-monarchical pro-parliamentary faction, as seeking to prevent a consolidation of power within the executive branch and being confined to the legislative branch. Clay became a strong advocate for congressional supremacy and national leadership, making this a core tenet of the Whig platform. Jackson continued and furthered the original Jeffersonian vision of decentralization, agrarianism, expansionism, and democratization. His Democrat Party would become the dominant force within the country and would do away with the national bank, which Jackson saw as a den of corruption, further restrict infrastructure funding, which he felt was purely a matter of concern for state governments, but he did largely keep Clay's tariffs in place, seeing the need for America to become more self-reliant. Clay would run once again, this time against Jackson's protege James K. Polk in 1844, but still fell short of victory. Having narrowly lost on account of Whig William Henry Harrison's early death and the failure of his vice president to execute the Whig agenda, instead pushing forward policy more in line with the Democrat ideology, including initiating an annexation of Texas, which became a hot-button issue for the 1844 election, and which Polk appeared more determined to see through than Clay, ultimately costing him the presidency. Clay had returned to and remained in Congress following the end of his term as Secretary of State. Now serving as a senator, Clay watched year after year as the country seemingly slipped further away from him and toward deeper division. Clay and his peers did what they could to mend these divides and resolve national issues as they arose, but ultimately differences grew out of hand, and Clay's efforts to bring about a North-South compromise could do little to stop the coming Civil War. But what if all of that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, Henry Clay became president? As we've already said, 1824 would not be Clay's best year, nor would Clay's political identity be fully developed by that point. 1832 and 1844 would be Clay's best opportunities, but the odds against Clay in 32 were still very high. 1844 would be just close enough that a single minor occurrence could have swung the election one way or the other. But by that point in time, Clay would need to contend with an already entrenched Democratic establishment, which would make Clay's presidency and agenda all the more complicated. The 1844 election was defined by the outgoing Harrison Tyler administration, the first Whigs to hold presidential office, ineffectually I might add, as well as the matter of the Texas annexation, which itself was tied to the balance of power between the North and South and the expansion of slavery. President Tyler would be the one to officially put forward a proposed annexation of Texas, but only did so at the very end of his term and by utilizing the victory of Polk over Clay as justification to Congress that the public was in favor of annexation on account of their electing the pro-annexation candidate. The offer of annexation to Texas would narrowly pass the Senate, and months later Texas would accept the arrangement. But this time, things are different. Through careful strategizing, Clay is able to just barely turn the tables on Polk and win with a 1-point lead. Tyler is unable to sway a majority within the Senate, and the proposition to annex Texas is never officially made. Clay's official stance on the issue was that he would shoot down any attempts at Texan annexation unless there was a widespread public consensus for its acquisition. With the North determined to prevent the expansion of slavery through the admittance of another slave state, the odds of Clay following through on this annexation are extremely low, and for the time, Texas would remain independent, and the Mexican-American War would never occur. As a consequence of this, the political future of Texas would be reoriented. Since independence, there had been a division between nationalist and pro-American factions, the latter, of course, seeking union with the United States, while the former sought continued Texan independence and westward expansion to the Pacific Ocean. Having once again had their overtures for annexation rejected by the US, Sam Houston's pro-American faction would suffer a loss of popularity, especially when, just as in our timeline, Houston, in an effort to prevent a one-on-one war with Mexico, began considering renegotiating an arrangement to rejoin Mexico as an autonomous state, or the possibility of assuming a protectorate status under Britain if it were to abolish slavery. This reorientation would grant Mirabeau Lamar's nationalist faction added momentum in the following years, putting Texas on an expansionist path come 1848, that is, if they could maintain their independence. Texas at the time was in a dire financial situation, and men like Sam Houston thought independence was in the long term unsustainable. Lamar was aggressive and instigated tensions with both Mexico and the violent Comanche tribes which resided in northwestern lands claimed by Texas. In all likelihood, Houston's immediate successor, Anson Jones, would seek some form of peaceful arrangement with Britain and Mexico to preserve Texan autonomy and ensure peace along the border. Jones was a more pragmatic figure than the opposing Houston and Lamar, having been on both sides of the annexation debate at various points. If annexation was truly off the table, even if only for the time being, achieving Mexican recognition of its independence, even if at a cost, was necessary. And so, in exchange for Britain's support as a mediator, Texas would abolish its practice of slavery, agree to never again seek annexation by the United States, establish a reciprocal alliance with Britain in the event of war with the US or Mexico, and establish preferential trade relations with Britain. The British would focus on propping Texas up as a challenging force to check further American expansion westward, and once the Republic was stabilized, may encourage Texas to further its own expansion to the Pacific. The role of Texas in this timeline is especially interesting as without the Mexican-American War and the subsequent Mexican cession, the only other large group of American settlers in those southwestern lands would be the Mormons, as the Illinois Mormon War would have still triggered the Mormon exodus to Utah, and these Mormons are still likely to pursue the establishment of the state of Deseret, though whether or not they'd now seek annexation by the US is questionable, potentially leading to a rivalry between the pro-British Texas and the pro-American Deseret for control of the Southwest. Texas was not the only territory on the line at the time, mind you. In our timeline, James K. Polk resolved the long-standing dispute over the Oregon Territory, extracting for the United States the most valuable parts of the territory. Henry Clay, however, did not take a clear stance on Oregon during his campaign, but still may have pursued a resolution given the strategic value of a port into the Pacific, fellow Whig Daniel Webster's past efforts to acquire the territory, Clay's firm desire to retain independence from British domination on the continent, and the lack of controversial baggage attached to Oregon as was attached to Texas. In our timeline, the Mexican-American War had dominated Polk's focus while in office, but outside of this he had seen to lowering tariffs and providing firmer financial stability to the nation through the re-establishing of an independent treasury in place of a national bank to maintain a separation of bank and state. Under Clay, the national bank would instead be re-established, restoring government control over national commerce. The Black Tariff of 1842, which raised average tariff rates to 40% and which was repealed by Polk, would remain in effect, and likely be bolstered by additional tariffs bringing the national average to or above 50%, significantly reducing American imports and inciting foreign powers to increase their tariffs in response. Realizing the need to address Southern desires for lucrative export markets, Clay would get to work on pushing forward massive infrastructure programs financed by the revenue generated from increased tariffs and from a mass sale of public lands at high prices. In our timeline, Polk had vetoed infrastructure projects brought before him by Congress, including the Rivers and Harbors Bill, which would have worked to develop ports along the Great Lakes and surrounding rivers, as well as a bill for the development of the Wisconsin Territory. Both projects would certainly see approval by Clay, who would push for further developments between the South and northern cities so as to provide them access to richer domestic markets. Of course, Clay would still find difficulty passing through parts of his agenda given that the Democrats would continue to dominate the House and Senate during his first 2 years in office, and likely maintain control of the House in the latter 2 years of his term. But for the sake of the scenario, we'll assume he's able to achieve the majority of his less divisive platform through his proven skill of negotiation and compromise. If we assume Clay's agenda is successful and doesn't face any major controversies, he'd already be lined up for a second term, as Whig candidate Zachary Taylor had won the 1848 election in our timeline by a safe margin, albeit with former Democrat Martin Van Buren splitting both votes by running on an anti-slavery ballot. If anyone other than Jackson was capable of securing a second term during this turbulent era, it would certainly have been Henry Clay. Clay wouldn't need to deal with the same post-war consequences Taylor had, as once again the Mexican-American War simply wouldn't have happened. However, there are a whole slew of new issues for him to contend with, including the existence of a pro-British Texas now on America's southwestern border, and the continued need to win over the South in the face of rising tariffs and the restricting of slavery's expansion westward. With Oregon secure, early work would begin on the development of a transcontinental railroad and an expanding rail network between the North and South. With domestic production on the rise, more investment would be placed into America's naval and merchant fleets. And with the issue of slavery's expansion largely resolved, national focus would instead turn to how the practice might be gradually eradicated with consideration to Southern needs, and without inflaming North-South tensions to the point of hostility. Clay's presidency would be defined by a hard shift to domestic policy, but in the scope of America's long-term role in the world and in relation to other rival powers. As a consequence of this, Commodore Perry isn't dispatched to Japan, never opening it up to trade and allowing it to remain isolationist. Napoleon III's attempt to annex Hawaii probably goes unchallenged. Mexico holds on to what would have become the American Southwest until conflict ultimately breaks up between Deseret and Texas for control of the region, serving as an essential proxy war between Britain and America. Through Clay's leadership, American development would have rocketed along at an accelerated pace, making the US by the end of his administration an industrial powerhouse easily capable of overwhelming Britain and other rivals in a continental war, and truly defining the country as the leader of the American sphere. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.